Great. So we'll go ahead and kick off things. My name is Danette Wilkins, and I am a Family Planning Program Officer with the Johns Hopkins Center for Communication Programs, supporting the USAID-funded Breakthrough Action Program. And I'm so delighted to welcome you all today to this event. Next slide, please. So once more, welcome to the Interagency Gender Working Group Male Engagement Task Force event, Men and Boys Mental Health, Emerging Evidence and Innovative Approaches. We're so glad to have you join us today for this really engaging discussion and for these excellent presentations. Next slide, please. As we will be discussing mental health and related issues, we just want to check in with everyone and let you know that some of the content that we'll be addressing today may be sensitive or upsetting. We'll be talking about topics such as gender-based violence and suicide. And we recognize that this content will impact us in different ways. We encourage you to do what you need to take care of yourself both during and after this event. If you need to leave the event for any reason, please feel free to do so. We understand that folks are holding a lot during this time. At this point, I'd like to turn things over to my colleague, Dominic Shattuck, who's Director of Monitoring, Evaluation, and Learning at the Johns Hopkins Center for Communication Programs. Over to you, Dominic.
All right, thank you very much, Danette. Really excited to get moving today and get this conversation started. As Danette mentioned, I work directly with her and represent the Breakthrough Action and project in Johns Hopkins Center for Communication Programs, and I'm co-chair of the Male Engagement Task Force. You can see here on the slide are my other colleagues and co-chairs who will represent a range of organizations, and we'll hear from a few of them today in our presentation. So if you'll go to the next slide, please. For those of you who are new to our events, the Male Engagement Task Force works with experts across the globe to identify best practices and gaps in research relating to programs for men and boys. These are not just any programs, but those that focus on improving health, as well as promote gender equality. The experts, including some of you here today, reflect a wide range of experiences in health topics. And it's important that we utilize events like today to help disseminate best practices as well as spark conversations. Today's topic of men and mental health has definitely garnered a lot of interest, and I'm excited to see where this takes us. If we go to the next slide, please. One guidance document that the task force created was a do's and don'ts for engaging men and boys. This brief document provides some general guidelines around developing research and programmatic activities for men, and the do's and don'ts have been featured within several different global programming activities. It's also been translated into several languages, including French, Spanish, Portuguese, and most recently Swahili. The Swahili version is not yet available on the website, but we can send, if you let us know, we can send you copies of that as well. We'll drop the link to those documents in the chat, and it'll be included in the summary materials that are disseminated after the presentation. If you go to the next slide, please. Mental health issues are challenging for men and women. It's important to recognize that often our programming is not designed to address acute mental health issues like depression or bipolar disorder, as Paul Bolton will discuss shortly. Rather, we'll attempt to promote general wellness through our programs and facilitate equitable opportunities to achieve health goals. Considering this, our objectives today are twofold. First, we want to explore emerging evidence and innovative approaches for addressing men and boys' mental health and global health programming. And second, we want to engage our field of experts, you all, to learn more about your experiences and knowledge of mental health programming. Unfortunately, our time is short today, so I'm very hopeful that this will be only the first event on this very important topic. If you go to the next topic, next slide, please. To give a brief overview of our event, first we'll spend some time today hearing from individuals with interesting and insightful experiences related to men and mental health. After our three presentations, we will go into breakout groups to capture individual experiences and learn more about what you feel are priorities for this work. So I'm asking you to kind of hear me out, and I'm going to ask this later on as well, but please stay with us through the great breakout groups, because this conversation is breaking new ground for us, and we want you to be part of that building as we kind of move forward on this topic area and see how it works and fits into our reproductive health programming. If you'll go to the next slide. Before we move to the speakers, I wanted to share 4 graphics. The data behind the graphics come from the Carnegie Mellon Symptom Survey, which I work on through support from Facebook. More than 1 million men and women from the United States contributed data to these graphics. And the graph on the left presents rates of self-reported depression among men and women. The graph on the right represents anxiety reported among the same population. Well, we want to enter this conversation about mental health, understanding that is not a competition. This is not a zero-sum game. Yes, rates of both are high and higher among women. But what this graphic represents to me are big portions of both populations facing a very difficult challenge. We'll go to the next slide, please. Again, the same sample provided data for these 2 graphs, and you'll see similar patterns for worries about illness and in their homes, and worries about finances. So to focus on these issues as only male or only female will result in only half a solution. Collectively, we discussed the potential impact of wellness variables like those graphed here on reproductive health outcomes. So we're trying to tie this back into our reproductive health programming. And I think our first speaker, Paul Bolton, will provide a very strong foundation from which to consider these graphs and the topic in general. So right now I'm gonna introduce our first speaker, Paul Bolton, who is the USAID Mental Health and Psychosocial Support Coordinator. This is a new position to advance the size and quality of USAID's global work in mental health and psychosocial support. Dr. Bolton has more than 20 years of experience in MHPSS, working in program design, implementation, monitoring and evaluation, and research with international and local NGOs and governments. He's worked with programs and research in Europe, Southeast Asia, Latin America, the Caribbean, Africa, the Middle East, and the Pacific region. Paul, if you'd like to take it away.
Great, thanks, Dominic. Thanks to you and Danette and the task force for inviting me. It's my privilege to give some introductory and background remarks to this webinar. Let's go straight ahead. If you could give me the next slide, thank you. So, mental health is a state of well-being in which the individual realizes his or her own abilities, can cope with the normal stresses of life, work productively, and contribute to his or her community. This is the WHO definition of mental health, and as with the definition of health generally, it's important to realize it refers not just to the absence of disease, but also speaks to the positive side, to having a state of well-being, of being resilient, and in particular of being able to function. And by function, we mean being able to fulfill our role in our families and in the wider society. Next slide, please. We know that in order to help others, we need to be healthy and whole ourselves. Many of the programs that I see that involve men treat them only as support mechanisms for women and children, instructing men on how to be better parents or spouses and boys on how to treat girls better. And these programs are important, but they'll have limited effectiveness if we don't address the issues of men and boys. Not only do we need them to be healthy in order to provide support, but frequently the mental health problems of men and the effects of these problems are among the main problems that women and children have to deal with, because they contribute to poverty, substance abuse, conflict, and violence. The irony is that whether we care about men directly or we only consider them as family supports, either way, we need to address the mental health of men and boys. Next slide. This slide shows the major mental health problems of men and women. Depression is the most common mental condition in the world and the #1 cause of disability. In fact, mental health conditions collectively account for about 1/3 of global disability. In the past, it was thought that depression was more common in women, And this may be the case, but I suspect that the way we diagnose depression tends to focus on female symptoms like feeling sad, whereas men often experience different symptoms such as anger and lashing out. And because those are not included in the diagnostic criteria, it can look as if women have more depression. But I think the truth is that they're closer to the same levels than we might think. Also, there's a global expectation of stoicism and quiet strength that is expected of men. And that makes depression more difficult to detect and makes men much less likely to talk about their problems than women, or even to reach out for help. And the same is true for anxiety. And again, this can make it seem as if depression and anxiety are less common in men when perhaps they're not. All over the world, men experience violence, beginning in boyhood with physical bullying and more frequent physical punishment in the family. Men are much more likely than women to experience criminal violence. And in all countries, the bulk of soldiers are men. So all of these experiences make PTSD and trauma an issue for men. Bipolar disorder is experienced as depression punctuated by periods of mania where the mind is racing. It affects men and women equally. Psychoses are conditions with many of the features of depression and anxiety, but characterized by hallucinations of seeing and hearing people and things that are not really there. And this affects men and women equally. So for all of these, depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress, bipolar disorder, psychoses, we see that I think that they are similar for men and women. But there are two things that are different. One is substance abuse. Men are much more likely to abuse substances than women. And the second is suicide. Suicide is very different for men and women. All over the world, 800,000 people die from suicide every year, which is more than die from HIV or malaria. Male suicide rates are 13.9 per 100,000 globally, which is twice that of women. And men are 3 and 4 times more likely to die from suicide than women. Next slide. So what is particular about male mental health? How does it differ from that of women? Mental health problems can be more difficult to detect amongst men because, as we noted before, due to the male role model of being aloof and stoic and less willingness to reach out to others for help. This unwillingness to talk extends to treatment, which is a problem since many of the most effective and feasible methods of treatment are talk therapy. Who men are willing to talk to is also more selective than for women, with a strong preference for other men, and particularly for men with similar backgrounds and experiences as themselves. For this reason, the use of peer counsel is an important aspect of successful treatment for men. All of us have coping mechanisms, behaviors that we use to deal with the stresses of life. For men, how we deal with stress and mental health problems much more often involves violence, including suicide and harming others, and substance abuse, often alcohol. These two coping mechanisms are particularly harmful for those who use them and for those around them. Next slide. This diagram is an illustration of the connections between mental health and health among men, women, and children. This diagram illustrates some of the commonest known connections based on research. If you look at the left side of the slide, you can see there is solid evidence that male mental health results in reduced function, including ability to earn money, which contributes to poverty and the stress of poverty. Coping mechanisms using substance abuse and violence results in other family members being subjected to abuse, violence, and the deprivation of poverty. All of these cause stress and distress. For women in the family, this stress causes their own mental health problems. And these mental health effects and the deprivation of poverty contribute to poor nutrition, poor reproductive health, as well as reduced family planning with more pregnancies. This then results in more children with poor early childhood development, poor nutrition, and more infectious diseases. Poverty and compromised parenting by both parents also results in reduced care seeking. The process is cyclical, as shown by the red arrows. The poor mental and physical health of the mother and child contribute to the stresses on the father, while male children grow up to have reduced physical and mental health with greater likelihood of violence, substance abuse, and suicide. Next slide. I'd like to suggest a framework for thinking about the mental health of men and boys. First, keep in mind that some of the challenges that men typically face across cultures are different from women. I noted before that the typically rigid expectation of dominance over the family and the greater expectation and acceptance of violence amongst men. Remember that men more often respond to stress and mental conditions with anger, aggression, violence, and substance abuse than do women. This is partly symptoms and partly coping mechanisms. Mental health and psychosocial support services can help men to better understand themselves and give them information and skills to deal with their emotions. It can train men and boys to recognize mental health issues and seek help, recognize destructive coping mechanisms, and develop and use alternative constructive ways of coping. We have found in our programming and in our research that if we provide support by trained local peers, we can get men to engage in mental health services and to improve. We've also seen that once men see their fellows improving, that this can encourage more men to seek care. Finally, I just want to end by emphasizing that we have the knowledge and capacity to assist most men to lead happier lives and to be a help rather than a hindrance to their families and to their communities. Next slide. Thank you. And thank you for the privilege of being able to present these remarks.
Thank you, Paul. That's an excellent way to frame up and kind of give us a way in which to think through the different research and programmatic activities that are going to be presented next. And I think it's a great resource that USAID has put you and this position in their greater portfolio of work. And I think we'll see some of the linkages between that and the work we've been doing on reproductive health as this conversation evolves this morning. So I'm going to move into our next, if you go to the next slide, please. We're going to move into our next two presenters, are Julie Pulowitz and Ann Goddard from the Population Council. Julie is the director of Population Council's HIV and AIDS program, where she provides leadership for a portfolio of research that generates evidence to inform HIV programs and policies around the world. Social behavioral scientist, Dr. Pulowitz has over 20 years of experience in implementation science and impact evaluations, with particular expertise in gender and male engagement, sexual and gender-based violence, stigma, and social and behavior change. Ann Goddard, Dr. Ann Goddard is a social and behavioral scientist specializing in HIV prevention, sexual and reproductive health, intimate partner violence, and gender relations. At the Population Council, Goddard oversees various implementation science studies for the DREAMS initiative, funded by the Gates Foundation and USAID, and for the Council's Strengthening Operational AIDS Research, or SOAR project, funded by USAID's PEPFAR, primarily in African countries. Prior to joining the Council, she worked on a series of NIH-funded community mobilization and HIV prevention trials in South Africa. Goddard received a PhD and MPH in Health and Behavior from UNC Chapel Hill and a BA from Brown University. So I'll pass it over to Julie and Ann next to talk about their research and how some of the mental health components of that played out. So go ahead, please.
Great, thanks, Dominic. And thanks also, Paul, for that excellent overview presentation. I think it really sets the rest of the presentations up nicely. So we're very glad to have the opportunity to share some analyses we've recently completed regarding men's experiences of childhood and lifetime trauma and their effects. My name's Ann Goddard, as Dominic said, and I'm presenting today alongside my colleague, Julie Pulowitz, who will take over for me later in the presentation. Next slide. Trauma can be defined as an emotional response to a deeply distressing or disturbing event, and it can be acute, chronic, or complex in its nature. There's increasing recognition of the pervasiveness of trauma and its effects on a range of negative outcomes. For men, these include effects on both their own health and well-being and on their partners' and families' health and well-being. There are also well-documented links between trauma or violence and gender, especially with restrictive masculinities, as Paul mentioned. There are several key gaps in the evidence base around trauma and its effects, especially among men. For example, most studies focus only on traumas experienced in childhood or in adulthood, but rarely both, making it difficult to compare effects. Similarly, there is little evidence available on the cumulative effects of trauma, particularly those occurring beyond childhood. And documenting such traumas across varied contexts is also a relatively new endeavor, also focused largely on violence against children. Next slide, please. So we sought to fill some of these gaps through analyses of data from an implementation science study in Malawi, Eswatini, and South Africa. We conducted this study with male partners of adolescent girls and young women in the context of a very large-scale HIV prevention program called DREAMS. DREAMS is a multi-sectoral program that sought to reach adolescent girls and young women directly, support risk reduction among their partners, and influence community and structural contexts that give rise to HIV vulnerability. Next slide, please. The data presented here come from cross-sectional surveys with men in 2017 to 2018. In Eswatini, this included over 1,000 men ages 20 to 34 in 19 districts spanning the country's 4 regions. In South Africa, surveys were done with nearly 1,000 men ages 20 to 40 in 2 informal settlements in Durban. And in Malawi, the sample included over 600 men ages 18 and over from 2 rural areas. We use systematic random sampling at venues where men socialize and meet new partners using the PLACE method, as well as at HIV service sites. Data analysis included describing the prevalence of traumas and multivariate logistic regression to assess associations between different types of traumas, as well as cumulative traumas on a range of adverse outcomes. Next slide, please. So we thought it would be important to share the precise measures we used, both to be clear about what traumas men were asked about, and in the hopes that some of you may use these and similar measures in your future research. These questions came from our colleagues, Andy Gibbs and Rachel Jukes at the Medical Research Council in South Africa. Next slide, please. Men were 26 years old on average, and most were employed. Most in South Africa and Eswatini had completed secondary school, while only about a quarter had in Malawi. Less than 1/5 of men were married or cohabiting in Eswatini and South Africa versus half in Malawi. And over 1/3 in each country had experienced orphanhood, which was one form of trauma assessed. Next slide, please. So turning to reported levels of other childhood traumas, the most common was being beaten at home, with 1/3 reporting this happened often or very often. Seeing or hearing one's mother being beaten and being forced to have sex were substantially less prevalent. However, they are still not negligible. Next slide, please. In terms of traumas more likely experienced in adulthood, we can see that being robbed at gunpoint or knife point, witnessing an armed attack, and being or feeling close to death were all most prevalent in Durban, followed by Eswatini and Malawi. Next slide, please. And in terms of cumulative trauma exposure, over 3/4 of men in each country had experienced at least one trauma. A majority had experienced 2 traumas, including 2/3 of men in South Africa, and over 1/4 in South Africa and Eswatini, and nearly a quarter in Malawi had experienced 3 or more traumas. So I'll now turn it over to Julie to take you through the rest of the slides. Next slide, please.
Again, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Julie Pullerwitz. Thank you, Anne. And I'll be taking us through the second half of the presentation. And this will be focused more on the health outcomes and their relationship and associations with being exposed to trauma in childhood and over the life course in these 3 settings. And these are the 6 outcomes that we're highlighting in particular. The first being depression and anxiety through a 4-item validated measure: hazardous drinking, intimate partner violence perpetration, the reporting of multiple sexual partners over the last year, and transactional sexual relationships over the last year, which is defined as giving money or gifts for the purpose of either starting or maintaining a sexual relationship. And as you'll see in all 3 of the countries, quite a substantial proportion reported all of these 6 outcomes that we're sharing right now. And if we just look at depression and anxiety as an example, given the importance, given the topic of our conversation today, you'll see almost 1/3 of men in South Africa reported, in this case, moderate or severe depression or anxiety. That's what we measured as depression or anxiety, moderate or severe. In Eswatini, you see almost 20% and over 1/3 in Malawi. Next slide, please. We put this slide first to really show you the visual of the strong dose-response relationship. And what we mean by that is when you look at increasing numbers of traumas across all 3 countries and across the 5 outcomes that we're highlighting here, you see an increasing proportion of men reporting these outcomes. So if we look at depression and anxiety, for example, on the right in the visual in the bar chart, the green bar shows no trauma. And if you look at Eswatini, for example, about no trauma reported, about 40% reported depression and anxiety, while 1 or 2 traumas, it goes up to 50%. And then if you look at 3 or more, and in this case, up to 8, which are the traumas we measured, this goes up to about 70% of men reporting depression, a moderate to severe depression or anxiety. Next slide, please. Now we're going to be turning to multivariate analyses, where we're taking into account a number of other variables simultaneously. So in essence, we're taking away the effects of other important variables that include age, education, marital status, and site, and still see these significant, strong relationships between being exposed to trauma and their health and having health effects. This slide in particular highlights the differences and the similarities between childhood and adult exposure to trauma. So in the first grouping on the top, the rows, these focus on childhood trauma. And if you, for example, take a look at depression and anxiety here, you'll see that those who were exposed to 1 or more childhood traumas were more than twice as likely in South Africa to report depression or anxiety. And in Malawi, almost twice as likely, as an example. If you look at adult trauma below, perhaps looking at the middle row, intimate partner violence perpetration, you'll see that those who report exposure to adult trauma, like being robbed at gunpoint, you'll see that they are in South Africa, men are more than twice as likely to report perpetrating violence against a partner than if they had not been exposed to this trauma as an adult, and almost twice as likely in Malawi. So you'll see lots of stars on this slide, and those are the significant relationships. Next slide. We're now also looking at it from a cumulative perspective, so cumulative trauma over time. And you'll see here that for those who were exposed to 1 to 2 traumas over their lifetime, as compared to those who were not exposed to any trauma, as reported by men, they are more likely to, for example, perpetrate intimate partner violence in South Africa. And for those who are exposed to 3 or more traumas, they're almost 5 times as likely to report the IPV perpetration. So while it isn't for every single variable here, you'll see all these stars showing the cumulative effects, where There's significant relationship with exposure to 1 or 2 traumas, often twice as likely to report these outcomes. It goes up to 5 times or more as likely when they're exposed to 3 or more traumas. For example, if you look on the right in Malawi, that line of 5, 5, and 4, 4, 4. Next slide, please. I'm going to have one slide summarizing the findings and then another with some implications. So what we want to highlight here is that for men who participated in this study in all 3 of these settings, and these settings in South Africa, Eswatini, and Malawi really ranged in the type of setting they were, and that one was all the way across the country, as Adam described. Another was more of an urban and a peri-urban setting, and another was more of a rural setting. And in all of these contexts, men's experiences of violence and trauma were very common. More than half reported 2 or more, and up to a third 3 or more. We also saw that reports of childhood traumas, such as being beaten at home, was very high and very consistently high across all settings, while adulthood traumas, such as being robbed at gunpoint, varied somewhat depending upon the setting. We also saw that trauma was associated with a range of outcomes, adverse outcomes. So this was true whether the trauma took place in a childhood or in adulthood. And as Anne mentioned earlier, there are a few studies kind of looking at both simultaneously. So trauma in adulthood and trauma in childhood separately, simultaneously led to negative health outcomes. We also saw that for all 8 of the traumas we mentioned, including mental health that was associated with adverse outcomes, as well as a really strong dose-response relationship, where you were exposed to more traumas over time, you were more likely to report these negative outcomes, whether it be anxiety and depression, or whether it be, for example, violence against a partner. And that leads me to our third bullet, which is to highlight that these findings show the important negative and dramatic effects for both men and their mental health, as well as for their partners and families. Next slide, please. This slide highlights some additional findings and selected publications from the portfolio of work under the DREAMS Implementation Science umbrella, where we are learning more about, for example, the characteristics and relationship dynamics of male partners of adolescent girls and young women in Malawi, the second example, and to make those available for those who are interested in additional information. So that first example was just published, and that looks particularly at transactional sexual relationships and bringing men's perspectives into it. Most that has been published to date has been around women's perspectives on transactional sexual relationships. And this kind of complements that perspective with understanding more about motivations and experiences from the perspective of men. The third example is a study where we were creating risk profiles, in this case, HIV risk profiles for men, and showing that it looks different among different groups of men, in that there were younger high-risk men and there were older high-risk men, and some they had quite different characteristics. So the intention was to be able to tailor programming more effectively. So here's a list of publications around reaching men with programming around HIV and violence in particular to reduce risk. Next slide. Well, we're running out of time, so let me just quickly go through the implications. So there's quite a clear need for programming and policy based on what we were just sharing to both prevent interpersonal violence within families, violence in communities, as well as to support adaptive coping for men that have experienced traumas. And we wanted to highlight that options do exist to do both. We highlight a few below with quite a range, from normative change in the communities to couples interventions around positive parenting. Some that Paul mentioned in his earlier presentation, psychosocial support and psychiatric support. And we would just want to say that there, as we go ahead in the field to try to address this huge issue, mental health and their related sequela for men and trauma and exposure to trauma, we need to learn more about how to adapt it and refine it in different contexts, as well as how to scale it up and sustain it. And so make it, institutionalize it. wanting to acknowledge my many colleagues that worked on this project and the funding from the Gates Foundation and PEPFAR. And then one more slide. Acknowledging my co-authors on this work, in addition to Anne Goddard, who presented with me. We have Tracy McClare, Patrick Shabangu, Shariq Haywood, Effie Chipetta, and Sanyukta Mathur. So I thank you very much and for inviting me to, or enabling me to present, and I enjoy looking forward to the following discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julie and Ann. That was great. And it was a great example of how integrating these measures into your work around HIV and HIV prevention, it really can provide very rich insights. And, you know, if people have questions to ask, please drop them into the chat. We have a few minutes to answer a couple of questions. I think the first question was asking something very specific around measurement, around transactional sex measure that was used in the research, whether or not that was focused on men being the provider of the gifts or receiving gifts. But I think in your answer, if you wouldn't mind talking just a little bit about the fact that there are validated measures that practitioners can use to, you know, as you did, and the measures you presented today in the work, and that it's not making this up as you kind of go along. I think it's important for people to understand the measures are out there for their work. If you wouldn't mind talking about that for a moment.
So why don't I jump in first, Anne, and please add anything you think would be important. So when we started this process, we were trying to, of the DREAMS work, we were trying to move beyond the measures that were only around exchanging sex for goods and services, which was the most common ways that people were measuring transactional sex, but it really focuses on commercial sex work. And so measures have been developed since then and validated that look at the concept of transactional sex. And here the essence is around starting or maintaining a relationship for the purposes of accessing goods, whether it be phone charge information or whether it be rent. It's kind of a range. And so this measure, because we asked men about this, was to look at how often they gave goods or services for the purposes of starting or maintaining a relationship. And when you ask women this question, it would be receive the services typically. And anything that you would like to add?
No, that's great. And I just echoed what Dominic had mentioned, that there's a range of excellent measures for these outcomes out there. So if you're doing research in these areas, be sure to look those up.
I think important that not to make this up as you're going along, that there is research to kind of call on. I think the other question that comes with this is just to kind of unpack it a little bit for the listeners this morning, is your next steps. So now you have these really rich findings, and so what are the next steps in terms of integrating this into programs? How will you go about that process of kind of addressing them as much as possible in the work that's going to be done?
Again, I'll start. We wanted to take this opportunity to kind of highlight the issues. So when the DREAMS started, it was very much to understand more about partners of adolescent girls and young women, with a focus on reducing the risk of adolescent girls and young women of HIV acquisition. And so what we wanted to understand more about the partners, and to make clear that men also are challenged in various ways, and you need to intervene with men as well, both for their own health as well as their partners. And so this kind of highlights that point here, and I think Paul highlighted it as well. We're going to hear more about some examples of programming, but to me, we need to really take these points into account to include to have trauma-informed programs when you're trying to reach men, for example. When you're thinking about norm shifts around violence, or you really need to take into account men's history of violence and how these norms are created and reinforced, for example. So I think it's important to incorporate this into programs going forward if we want to effectively reduce violence experienced by everyone, men, partners, children, etc. So one of the examples I shared was a parenting program on the slide that Dominic, actually you and I were both involved with, which was a randomized controlled trial showing the effects of sort of positive parenting and normative change within couples to reduce negative outcomes and violence. Anne, did you want to highlight anything else?
I know we have only a little time left, but to complement what Julie said, I guess I'd say that we're increasingly interested in online platforms that some of which we'll hear about in the next presentations. I think particularly during COVID, there's both increased recognition around mental health issues, as well as a proliferation, a lot more people getting online and being comfortable accessing content and as well as services online worldwide, and paired with, what we know are limited, often limited in-person, counseling and psychiatric services on the ground. I think this could be a really nice way to reach a lot more individuals, including men, and maybe a resource that men are perhaps more willing to access than in-person services as well, which
Right.
we'll hear about next.
Great. And there's at least one more question in the chat. So when you're off you can please answer that in the chat. And anyone else who has questions for Julie or Anne, please drop them into the chat, and maybe there's an opportunity to interact there with them about the research, resources, or anything else. If you'll go to the next slide, please. Thank you so much, Julie and Anne, for your presentation. I think it really does. This all dovetails very well together today. And our next presenter, Michael Baruti, who is a media journalist with over 10 years of experience in the journalism sector of Tanzania. Currently, Michael is a creative producer at Ubungo. His responsibilities include leading the creative version of Ubungo entertainment products and overseeing the implementation of the creative vision through each stage of production. Michael is also founder of Men, the podcast, a podcast that is aiming to bring up conversation about mental health for men in Tanzania. And I will say that over the last few weeks, it's been my pleasure to get to know Michael better and learn more about the work he's doing, and kind of, breaking ground in a way that's much, somewhat different than a lot of the, than much of the programs that we implement in our work in development. And so I think he's going to provide an interesting perspective and rich conversation for us to have. So Michael, if you wouldn't mind taking it away.
Well, thank you, Dominic. That was a very good introduction. I'm humbled. So yeah, I'm Michael Baruti, like Dominic said, and I'm a founder and a host of a podcast called Men, the podcast, which it is about mental health for men with a specific focus on Tanzanian men. Like we said, unlocking, unpacking, relearning, and unlearning. That is what the podcast is all about. Next slide, please. So the podcast emerged from a personal experience, the mental health challenge, the personal mental health challenges experience that I went through in the period between 2016 up to 2018. And because of that, I had to go through a therapy session sometimes in 2018, and actually found them to be quite helpful. So after going through the therapy session, I started to have more conversation with my friend around mental health challenges and the thing that I was going through. So I started having conversation with my friends about the personal experience about what I went through and what took me to therapy. And for most of the time, the responses I was getting was, "That's okay, that's normal. We all go through that, or that is not that special. That is something that you can deal with," and all that. So after that, I realized two main things. One, first of all, men, we've normalized and glorified mental health struggles, that it's okay and it's part of manhood. But also speaking about mental health challenges, taboo. It's not something that a lot of men were willing to, and are still not willing to talk about. But also toxic masculinity is influencing a lot of harmful behaviors for men. So those were the things that I found out after that. So I decided to send a tweet. Next slide, please. So I posted a tweet sometime in 2018, and I say that I've been meaning to do a podcast on depression, mental health for men, to discuss about the struggles we go through, expectations, fatherhood, fears, and what we think success is. It has to happen in 2019. This tweet was posted in November 11, 2018, and it got so much response that it was beyond my expectations. First of all, I think on Twitter, a lot of people acknowledged that there is a problem of mental health challenges for men. And two, most of them acknowledge that there's no platform to address the mental health challenges for men. But also people say, I think it's important now we started to have a talk about this. And then on one of the slides, somebody said he's even thought about suicide. So because suicidal thoughts, that's because there was no a platform before for them to speak and for him to have an understanding about whatever it is that he was dealing with. So he thought presence of a podcast and a platform to have a conversation around mental health for men would help to highlight the issues and maybe help save lives. Next slide, please. So the first episode was released in November 2019. And then we are releasing episodes after every 2 weeks. Like I said, it's a fortnightly episode. Up to mid-May 2021, we've released a total of 33 episodes. And our podcast, we get the reach, we get at least 5,000 plays per month. And we've been growing organically on Twitter and on Instagram. We have over 2,000 followers on Twitter and over 800 followers on Instagram. And again, like I said, it's just we are growing organically. And then we've talked about different issues. We've talked about things like male infertility, manhood and masculinity versus gender-based violence. We've talked about things like why men cheat. We've talked about things like blended family, fatherhood and therapy, all those things that we feel like are happening around our communities, but they're not being brought up. And then these are the things that men go through. So, and then so we provide a platform for people to actually come in and speak about things that, are not are rarely spoken of. Next slide, please. So the team the team of the podcast consists of two people mostly. There's me, a host and a journalist, but also to make it make more sense and for conversation to be credible and to be helpful, we thought that it would be really important to have a psychologist. So we have in our resident psychologist, Nadia Ahmed, who's a trained she's a trained counselor, therapist. She has her own organization that she runs called Mind Matters Tanzania. So she comes in and posts as a resident psychologist, but also she takes in a lot of questions, and she's the person that we refer to for people to go seek when they feel like they need further help from the conversation that we have. And also she brings in, like I say, she brings in the professional side of the conversation rather than it just being about, people just normal people talking, just normal people having conversation. But when the psychologist comes in now, she adds in weight to the conversation that we have. Next slide, please. So those what you see there is some of the responses that we've been receiving from our audiences. And well, mostly, if you can read from this course, that our listeners, they do enjoy the podcast, and then they relate to the conversation that me, Nadia, and our guests usually have. And also because we're discussing things men find very difficult to talk to about often, and then most of the things they go and discuss in our culture, and a lot of other things. So I think that is why most of our audience can actually relate to the things that we talk about. Next slide, please. So these are some of the our most popular episode. What makes a man, becoming your own man, fatherhood and parenting. We did an episode about becoming a man in the age of feminism and all those kind of stuff. So those are among the most listened episodes. We've also been featured in the press. Next slide, please. Yes, we've also been featured in the press based on the work that we do. As you can see, this These are some of the quotes that came from the press. And then The Citizen is the leading English newspaper in Tanzania. It circulates over 5,000 copies per day. It is read online by over 20,000 business people and people with influence in Tanzania. So for us to be actually being featured was quite an honor. We've also been featured on World News on the part of podcaster Reclaiming Storytelling in Africa. Me and Nadia both got featured to talk about the podcast, why we do the podcast, the impact it's having, and what we think the future of the podcast is, and the future of mental health is in Tanzania and Africa in particular. Next slide, please. So in amplifying the conversations, and we've realized, yes, podcast is one thing, but also we felt like there's the need to have further conversation and provide other platform for people to actually come in and have further conversations. So we launched an in-person event called Men Let's Talk, in which we bring in our men together in a closed room, no cameras, no recorders, no nothing. And then we have therapists there and counselors and just different men from different age groups to come in and have different conversation about different topics of our choosing. So last year we did 2 events. A total of 150 men attended. And then the event team, event 1, we talk about men, relationship, and finances, because this is something that, again, this topic were user-generated, as in what we call user-generated content, as in people picked up this topic and they said, this is something we wanted to discuss. So we feel like it was a very successful event. And then event number 2, we partnered with a consortium called Men Engage in Tanzania, and we had a conversation about toxic masculinity and gender-based violence. We talked about things like intimate partner violence, and the whole concept of violence, that where it comes from, why, and what can we actually do to try to address the basis of gender-based violence in Tanzania. Next slide, please. So what's next for us? First of all, we're trying to working hard on increasing our podcast reach through social media and mainstream media campaigns. We've invited on different platforms, we are here speaking about it. We've invited to also different media houses in Tanzania, radios and TVs, to talk about what we do. So we feel like we are growing, and our brand is as in the audience number is growing. But also we want to continue to expand the dialogue around men's mental health across Tanzania. That is the core of what we are trying to do. But also establishing brother cycles where men support fellow men, where it's okay for men to actually sit down and talk about what they're going through without feeling like they're being judged or they're being seen like less of a man just because of whatever it is that they're going through at the moment. So more like a safe space, but also exploring the use of community-based explore the use of community-based for localized engagement, meaning we're trying to see how we can actually provide some sort of psychosocial support within the community, where people can actually now at local level start to have further conversation about mental health for men, and also for community to understand that it's okay for men to go through stuff, and how can the whole community actually help out. But also we are leveraging the Men podcast to provide guidance and support, trying to look for partners who can actually come in and see if we can get some people who can actually say, we'll support this and we'll support this. And if we can get some more therapists to actually come in, or some organizations that can actually come in and say, we try to offer more support to people in need. This is something that Men, the podcast is looking and trying to achieve. Next slide, please. Yes, we hope also to create more impact. That means we've created our own organization called Health Minds Foundation. This was established in 2021. The aim is to promote community mental health and resilience, but also to improve access to mental health information, services, and resources. We are trying to address the diverse areas, including men and mental health, women, children, and everything. So the Health Mind Foundation will focus on a lot of other things rather than just men's mental health. Next slide, please. Thank you. That is all that I had time for today.
Thank you, Michael. This is great. Great to have you talk about some of the history and the topics and the way in which this has evolved over the last, last bit here in terms of in kind of ramping up the podcast. So there are a few questions. Luckily, we have your partner Nadia Ahmed in the chat room as well, answering a couple of those questions. But one of them, I think, kind of two of the questions actually come into play, and I think it's worth kind of expanding a little bit on, and that is around, you know, who are your target demographics? Like Nadia had mentioned in there that a lot of the people who download and interact on your podcast are in their 20s and 30s. Why do you think that your podcast speaks to that population? And also, what might be missing from men who are in their 40s or a little bit older men at this time? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's a good question, Dominic. Thank you. So I think when we started, we were trying to look at most at the people who at least have a little bit of an understanding around mental health, because again, it was a foreign concept in Tanzania, and we figured that it might be a little bit challenging to try to target everybody, but also podcasting was not something that everybody was aware of, at least in Tanzania, in our context. So I feel like when we started, we were lucky, as in there was a bit of a conversation around mental health that was starting to happen, especially with the younger generation. So, I mean, they've been exposed, they understand, they read things, they see what's happening around the world. So they have that little bit of understanding about what mental health, and probably most of them, they also want to do better. So maybe that is why most of them actually listen to our podcast. As you compare to the older generation, is what I like to think that these are the people who probably grew up in an era where in Tanzania, they never had this kind of conversation. You know, so this was something that is completely new. Now we are slightly getting them on the podcast, and some of them are actually coming and agreeing that we did not know about these things in the past. You know, so I feel like that is why. I mean, I feel like the timing was right, but also again, we also mostly use social media, things like Twitter and Instagram, where you get kind of people who are a little bit exposed. So they have that little bit of understanding, I think. So that is the answer that I can give you right now.
Great. And you mentioned briefly Twitter and Instagram. So what is the role that social media platforms play on your promotion, or like the way in which you get the word out about the podcast in general?
Oh, it plays. That's the only thing that we use to promote. Honestly, that's how we started. And luckily for me, being in the media for over 10 years, I have quite a bit of following on Twitter and on Instagram. So it was easier when I said that I wanted to do a podcast for people to take the jump on that. But that is the only thing that we use: Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook. We try to push it everywhere, and of course, to use the cycle that we have. But most importantly is to try to create good content that can actually cycle around and make sure that people, when they listen to it, they can always go back and listen for more.
Right. So one of the things that you had mentioned to me before too was that podcasts in general are not as widespread. Like in the US, podcasts are pretty ubiquitous. People know what they are and listen to them quite often. But in Tanzania, this is somewhat of an emerging market. And also that, you know, are you using YouTube at all in the work?
So we've started our YouTube channel. There was a little bit of a constraint in the past because the government regulation that we are supposed to pay to own a YouTube channel. And then again, at the moment, the podcast does not pay us anything. We use our own funds and our own resources to run it. So we were kind of a little bit hesitant. But then also our podcast is still mainly audio for now. And we figured that for something to be at least a bit of a hit on YouTube, it has to be visual. But then the regulation has changed, so we've created our own YouTube channel. So what we are doing now, we are uploading our past podcasts on the YouTube channel. We haven't started to broadcast it or to promote it yet, but we hope that we start doing visual this year. So that by the time we start doing visual, we hope there'll be a lot of content on our YouTube channel as well. But those are some of the things that we are aiming for this year, 2021.
Great. Great. And Michael, thank you so much to get to know you and about the podcast. Look forward to how this evolves over time. We have, networks to kind of build on as well. And I think a lot of our listeners, this is a very relevant intervention and programmatic activity that, might be relevant to the work that they're doing in the countries where they're working. And thanks again for participating, and Nadia for coming today as well. I appreciate her being here, and maybe another time we can talk more about how having a woman in the room in the podcast also changes some of the dynamics in the conversation in positive ways, and kind of rounding things out in that conversation. I'm sure it has a big impact. We're going to move on. If you don't mind going to the next presentation, we're going to move on to our next presentation from Colombia, the Calm Hotline. And our speaker from this project, and I apologize, my Spanish is not as good as some of my other name readings in other languages and cultures. Maria Fernecta Cepeda Anaya. So Maria is the leader of Gender and Diversity at the Subsecretariat of Citizenship Culture. Her work focuses on cultural and behavior change for gender equity, care, justice, and social inclusion. When she's not innovating at work, she shares her passion, the passion that I also have, which is bike riding around the countryside outside of the city, I believe she was saying. So today, she and her colleague will share their innovative program that engages men in meaningful ways during this extremely challenging time. So I'm going to pass it over to Maria right now. If she'd take over, and I think she's going to give her presentation in Spanish. So make sure you've clicked on the proper language button. And Maria, please take it away.
Thank you very much, Dominic, and thank you very much for all the team. Thank you for the invitation. We are very excited. My name is Maria Fernandez Cepeda, and I will be telling you the story about this strategy of cultural transformation called Linea Calma, or Calm Line. It is a hotline that was developed by the Secretariat for Culture, Recreation, and Sports of Bogota, and it is a cultural and behavioral transformation strategy to promote alternative masculinities, eliminate machismo, and prevent domestic and partner violence. And I will speak about machismo next. Next slide, please. The context. The context is that this strategy starts in 2019 when Claudia Lopez is elected first woman to serve as Bogota's mayor. And this brought many changes to the city. We were able to create two goals for the city, so eliminate gender-based violence against women and foster cultural transformation around machismo. The Secretary of Culture, which is where we work from, adopts it and adopts a citizen culture approach to reduce this gender-based violence. And the approach of citizen culture approach is very important because they want to create public institutions so that we can change our cities. This approach has four principles where we started to create this strategy. First, it is based on data driven. So it takes into account all data to work. They want to have a narrative transformation. They think that they believe in voluntary change. So we don't want to manipulate, we want voluntary change, and we believe that they are citizens as social change agents. With based on these four principles, the first thing we did in 2020 was that we looked at our domestic violence in Bogota. What we saw is that 66.5% of domestic violence in Bogota were partner violence. Most of them men, partners or ex-partners, former partners, or spouses, men that live with their spouse. And what were the motivations? For 55.9%, it was machismo and intolerance, and 20.9% jealousy and mistrust. What is machismo? And here I will give a small definition. Machismo is a cultural expression of Latin America where men and women have different expectations on their role. For example, for women, we expect from them to stay at home, to take care of the house, so that they are really in the internal and in the homework. For men, we expect them to be strong, sexually active, and that they do not express their feelings. Next, please. And the information we have is that everything that we can take into account to consider domestic violence, or if we speak about cultural acupuncture, is the fact of identify where we are going to be working on. And this will help us to be more specific and create more impact with our policies. So the decisions we're taking based on the data we are seeing is that we have to address intimate partner violence in men because most of them are men. And we have also to check on jealousy, control, and machismo, which are the primary motivations. Next, please. Thanks to this information, we were able to create 2 surveys about 1,500 people, men and women, to identify and know more about these topics and to see what are the norms, the beliefs of men and women around this topic. We have a lot of data on this topic, but it is very important that we speak about the most strategic ones for this conversation. First, we asked, have you ever been assaulted by your partner? 20% of women said yes, and 14% of men said yes. Both of them said that it was because of jealousy and infidelity. And what they said about the behavior, men said that they are victims of psychological violence, but women said that they had psychological violence, physical violence, but also life-threatening and also violence with an object, and that were not reported by men. If we also asked them, have you ever been violent towards your partner? 13% of women said yes, 14% of men said yes. And again, they were motivated by jealousy and infidelity. And when they spoke about these, they said that men and women equally reported psychological violence, and also 36% of women report that they pushed or were beaten. Next, please. What we saw is that behind this violence, we had a cultural component that was linked to love, linked to the idea of being a man or a woman. We also had information about social norms around masculinity. We asked men and women about their perception of what is expected of them in Bogota. And if you see the data, you can see that the expectations are very high and they are linked to machismo. For example, I will just choose a couple of them. 65% of men have to have a very active sex life. 52% they are expected not to let their partners cheat on them. They don't have to be humiliated. 36% have to respond aggressively if others fight them. 48% have to avoid expressing their emotions in public. And it is very important to check on this data. So we wanted to have a deep understanding, and we asked them another question. And 76% of men said that they would like to manage better their emotions, but they don't know how. 60% of men agreed that men struggle to recognize when they need help. And 56% agree that men are better at minding their own business, solving problems themselves. Next, please. With this information and with this basis, we created a hotline called Linea Calma, and it's a hotline for men that are 18 years and older. And what are our objectives? It's a hotline so that any man can call us and they can tell us whatever is happening in their life, if they're sad, if they're concerned, if they're happy or not. Why? Because we know that the first social norm of masculinity, and that we want to limit, is that the idea of men not being able to communicate emotionally. If they call 1 hour or 2 hours, the idea is that there is someone to listen to them. We know that nor jealousy, nor any other machismo attitude will finish with this call. So we created another service, a service that we call psychoeducational support. And this service create a space with 1 or 2 session with our psychologists so that men can unlearn machismo and they learn healthy nonviolent communication, and they can finish with these social norms about masculinity. Next, please. How does our hotline work? Next, please. Okay. So we started a pilot on December 2020, and a couple of days ago it finished. And we had this number, a very long number that you see on the screen, and we hope that it'll become shorter very soon. We had 8 professionals, 50% men, 50% women. And we know that some men are more comfortable with men or women to express their emotions. And the phone line was in service from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. from Monday to Friday, and Saturdays from 8 a.m. to 12. This schedule is changing because now we have a much better schedule. The psychoeducational service is run by psychologists via video calls and is scheduled once a week according to client needs. So it's based on appointments. Next, please. What are the services that Linea Calma does not offer? Linea Calma does not offer emergency calls. If we have, for example, calls for suicidal prevention or gender-based violence, or calls about mental health services or drug or alcohol use support, we cannot answer those calls. And what we do is that we refer those calls to another entity. And Linea Calma is not a hotline that works in silo. It works with a group. Next, please. What is our communication strategy? And here it is very important to understand that there is a link between the communication that's being created and the number of calls we are receiving. Since this is a very difficult topic, speaking about emotional needs in a machista society, what we do is that we are giving this service of hotline available to all men seeking emotional support. So we're not speaking about therapy or mental health. What we are doing is just inviting everyone. If you need emotional support, when you feel alone, when you feel jealous, what we do is that we create this language and we adapt it to the language we speak in Bogota, in Colombia. So men feel identified. We try to create identity, diversity. And we created a campaign in social media, but also on the newspapers. And the idea is that we can create the idea of many masculinities. Next, please. What are the preliminary results of our hotline? The results are from a couple of days ago, so it's not the current results, but we received about 1,800 men calls. And out of these calls, we were able to support about 1,065 men because some of the calls came at a time we were closed, and that's why we are going to change our schedule. We had 131 men that participated in these psychoeducational services, which is very exciting. And we had 654 virtual sessions held. 50% of men called because they were dealing with emotional crises, especially heartbreaks, family conflicts, and topics linked to fatherhood. 42% of men also reported domestic violence, including intimate partner violence because of jealousy and infidelity and caregiving. 4% of men were navigating situations related to gender violence in public space. The feedback we received from men, because we have calls with them every day, is that the hotline actually supported them very much so that they were able to deal better with their emotions. They said that no violent situations happened after receiving the hotline support and psychoeducational services, and 94% of them would recommend the hotline to other men. Next, please. So very quickly, what are our lessons learned? We know that men need and want support. They do call. We have been receiving calls every day. And we know that we have to communicate this strategy because every time we are creating communication, we are receiving more calls. And we know there are some cultural barriers and men do not ask for help. So we need to help men that are very diverse, because so far we are helping cisgender heterosexual men between 30 to 50 years. And now we want to create and engage in broader diversity of men. We are going to have a school for self-care for men so that they can have a space where they know how to care for themselves. And the idea is to interconnect them in not only topics as violence, but other topics of mental health for men. Next, please. And to conclude, because I think I'm over time, these are some of the testimonials we have received. And very quickly, I will read. I realize that everything is just like a circle. People tell us should behave this way. Abrupt, rude, and aggressive is not one. If not, one is not man enough. That's why I learned. My grandfather was the man of the house, and I want to follow his footsteps, to be a man who makes himself known. This contradicts the fundamentals of my behavior and what I have been taught, especially in terms of facing my fears. If you notice you fear something, you need to face it. That's contradictory, because while putting on armor may make us feel stronger, laying down our armor makes us feel more secure, at peace, and capable of establishing emotional and social bonds. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Maria. This was great. And I think our audience, there were a bunch of questions that had come in. I'm gonna ask one question, and then we're gonna transition over to the breakout groups, but people can ask questions in the chat, please. And maybe Maria can circle back to you during the process. So one of the questions is around training and talking about training the different counselors on how to manage the phone calls that come in. And just kind of interested to hear a little bit more about the resources and training program. And two things about that. One is, how do you train, each person that comes in or calls in to interact with the counselor or the receiver of the call, there may be a lot of different ways in which to engage them. How do you manage that variety of engagement that different men of different ages and different experiences will require? And also, do you manage any sorts of burnout, and how do you kind of coordinate burnout and ensure that the callers are fresh when they're able to answer those questions?
Yes, thank you very much, Dominic. I'm going to answer them in Spanish, if that's okay, with translation. Great question. One of our challenges was the training of our team, because it's a innovative hotline. We need to create the basis for the team that is going to be answering those calls. We have protocols. We have at least 4 protocols and 8 tools that we developed for the hotline so that the professionals can follow them. So the process of training included, it lasted about a month, and we were able to train them on how to use these protocols, these tools. And in this pilot, we also said that the training has to be constant. Every week we need to speak with them, we need to have different trainings so that we can follow up and reinforce the knowledge they have. Our professionals are psychologists and they are specialized, so they are also autonomous, not autonomous about how they work, so that they know how to apply their knowledge with men. And they have to follow these protocols and this training, this very detailed training. But we are still working on that. That's the truth. We are actually reviewing this on our pilot.
Great. And I'm sorry we don't have more time, but I think some of this may come out in the group discussions, or you shared a number of resources in the chat, and we can definitely link people to those resources. And thank you so much for the presentation, talking about the work, how it's kind of research driven, and you all did the research in the front end to kind of put the foundation of this work in place. And it sounds, well, I think people will be following it closely as it moves forward. So thank you very much, Maria, and the folks from the Calm Hotline. Right now, I'm going to transition over to Danette and Myra, you're welcome, who are going to move us to the breakout rooms. And please stay tuned, because like I said earlier in the day, we really are looking for you to help us build this foundation to find out where this work is going to fit into our reproductive health programming. So over to you, Danette and Myra.
Great, thank you, Dominic and Danette, and thank you to all the presenters for such great presentations. So I'll take us now to the fun participatory part of the panel and today's event. We are going to break you out into 6 groups. So we'll have a chance to discuss really one key question around where we think the priorities should be around advancing the field on men and boys' mental health, in particular as it relates to HIV, family planning, and maternal, newborn, and child health. The facilitators will guide us through that session and will then report back on the key takeaways when we come back to plenary. Great, thank you so much, Danette. So I'm just going to ask that the facilitators report back from their small group discussion what were 2 and most 3 of the key takeaways in response to the discussion question that you see here on screen. What is the biggest priority to advance the field of men and boys' mental health, especially in ways that can support positive global health outcomes related to family planning, maternal and child health, or HIV?
Please just take 1 minute. We are very short on time. So let's start with the first group.
Yeah, we had a small but very mighty group. So thanks to everyone who was in mine. We talked about some of the work that some of the folks who are in the group were currently doing, and also just really interested in having this discussion. It was new to a lot of us, so really exciting. I think a few of the takeaways are, one really, I think, important point that was made was that, a first step maybe in our organizations that we need to take stock on our own mental health. We need to set kind of values, maybe values clarification, and have an internal check-in on what mental health means for us in order to then kind of program effectively and see how those values cascade down into our programming or our research. So I thought that was a really foundational point that I wanted to share. We also talked about potential opportunities to advance the field in capitalizing on these digital media and digital products, and kind of understanding where boys and men communicate, how they communicate together, and where they get their information from. After hearing from different presentations today, it sounds like that could be an avenue of interest. And then another thing that we talked about just before we closed out was the cycle of violence. And do we really understand how mental health plays into that? And maybe that's an avenue to explore a little bit more in depth. Because that wasn't necessarily addressed head on in presentations, but it came up throughout the different presentations. So that was another kind of suggestion in terms of a priority, but short conversation. So love to continue it.
Great, thank you so much. And Danette, did you have a group? Because I'm seeing you listed here.
Yes, I'm the last group, but I can go ahead and share a little bit, and then I'll keep it very brief. We definitely talked a lot about the importance of really understanding the context in which you're working, and what exactly are the social and cultural barriers that are influencing mental health, and also the relationship that it has with other health outcomes. There's definitely a very wide conversation around family planning and the ways in which social and gender norms can condition access to family planning and also family planning outcomes as they intersect with mental health and gender-based violence. And I'll leave it at that so others can share as well.
Great. Dominic, do you want to go ahead and share?
Yeah, there were a few things that came up repeatedly, and several other elements that were really key, but kind of starting with accurate information. And building the lexicon and communication capacity of people to kind of work through issues, and understanding that oftentimes people don't have those negotiation skills or kind of articulation of some of the challenges that they're facing is a big issue, as well as in certain contexts, there is no lexicon around mental health, which has evolved differently in different settings. And also one of the kind of points that was made by one of our participants was around creating an enabling environment or some supporting structures. What are those support structures to kind of help mitigate some of the challenges that are identified in populations where we're working, and how soon can we get people engaged in that early, like we talk about it a lot in our gender work, starting early, starting young, and carrying out through those gender normative, equitable gender norms throughout the life course. How does this kind of play out as well for young people and their health and their ability to be mentally strong moving forward? All right, too long. Thank you.
Thank you, Dominic. Anne, do you want to report back?
Sure. Our group also talked about the importance of reaching adolescent boys and young men, and taking a life course perspective, as Dominic was saying, and really ensuring that early education builds skills around mental health. Also talked about helping men address stresses and anxieties, especially related to unemployment, and to recognize that mental health is fundamentally shaped by structural forces like poverty, social unrest, etc., and that we have to meet both meet men's individual needs as well as address the structural forces at the same time. Both are critical. That's it.
Interesting. Thank you. Julie?
Hi there. So we had an engaging conversation, and I'll highlight 3 themes that I think came out. One was around the importance of evidence generation. And in that, these issues are quite complex, and trying to understand how they fit together, IPV, mental health, all of these outcomes, so that you know how to tailor programming best. In addition to the fact that there are many countries who have no data on this information, on this topic, and they would like to be informed where they live. So that was one theme. A second theme was around the importance of addressing normative environments, so particularly gender norms that lead to machismo or norms in religious institutions, for example, that being an important entryway or an important focus for programming. And the third point being that thinking of mental health as a topic, as an opportunity to try to address a number of these other health outcomes that we care about and we're talking about. So mental health is important in and of itself, but in this framing of mental health, such as through the hotlines or through couple counseling, it's a real opportunity to address things like intimate partner violence and bring men into programming more effectively. Stop there.
Okay, great. And I'll report back from my group, which was also a very small group. We ended up being just 3. But our key points really were in terms of the needs. We think that there's more learning needed on how to engage men and boys to address social norms that drive these harmful behaviors, especially around domestic violence and other forms of gender-based violence, and that this change needs to really start in the family unit in relations within the home as well. And that we also need to train health professionals to really also be able to respond to mental health issues. So really bring together, the mental health capacity and bring that into the system, the formal health system. And so we just have a couple of minutes left, so I will close this out. I realize I didn't introduce myself. My name is Myra Beltran. I'm one of the Male Engagement Task Force co-chairs. And this discussion was really important for us to really think about not just only future directions on men and boys' mental health, but also develop some guidance around engaging men and boys more broadly in relation to family planning, HIV, and maternal newborn child health. As we saw, can we move to the next slide? As we saw and heard today, mental health issues often go undetected as they often manifest in anger and violence, unlike in women, which oftentimes express through sadness and depression. And men's mental health issues contribute to a range of gender and other health issues, including maternal child health and development outcomes. HIV risk behavior such as substance abuse, multiple sexual partners, intimate partner violence, and transactional sex. Perpetration of violence more broadly, which in and of itself leads to a range of health issues. And then overall decreased health seeking. And we also heard many aspects of mental health impacting relationship quality and communication, which can also impact things such as family planning and broader reproductive health. And it was interesting to hear across the presentations as well that the societal scripts around masculinity often prevent men from talking about their experiences of depression and trauma. And there's really an unmet need for men to talk about their challenges related to mental health, to get help to manage their emotions and build social bonds, as we saw through both Michael Baruti's presentation on the Men and Men podcast, as well as Maria Fernandez's presentation on the hotline in Bogota. It was interesting to hear from the breakout groups some common themes as well, the need for more research to really build or understand better the men's mental health issues across a range of different settings, to develop a lexicon. And I also saw and heard in some of the comments really the importance of developing a lexicon that might be less stigmatizing to be able to approach these issues. And then there was discussion around the need to address structural issues, both related to poverty and economics, as well as normative environments that might be contributing to the pressures that men face that contribute to these overall mental health issues. And to do that, we heard a call to both address or learn how we can change social norms, starting early in, for example, the family unit, as well as build a better response through working with health professionals to do that. And so with that, I will just provide a couple of reminders that we do have some upcoming one big upcoming event in September. Well, we also will continue this discussion and look at the state of the field more broadly in engaging men in the range of health issues that we work on. And we hope that from this discussion, as well as the discussion coming out of that, we'll be able to put together further guidance similar to the do's and don'ts that Dominic mentioned earlier, which we'll share links to. And thank you again for all of your participation. I know that we're 2 minutes over, and we really look forward to following up with many of you.
Great, thank you so much, Myra. And if you appreciated the discussion today, we also invite you to join the Male Engagement Task Force online community. I am currently dropping the link in the chat right now for you to go and see if you're interested in joining our online listserv where we share resources and events so that you can stay tuned. And we're also dropping the do's and don'ts for engaging men and boys, which is a guidance sheet that the co-chairs put together with the support of many of the Male Engagement Task Force members that really can help programmers and researchers and others to understand what they can do to better engage men and boys in gender equality and health promotion. Thank you again all so much for your interest in today's topic and for your contributions today. And we look forward to having you participate and join in future events. Take care.